Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the second live event of the Vermont Community Foundation's Insight Hub, an information series that will provide you all with actionable insight to inform your giving. Powered by the Vermont Community Foundation's experience and research and informed by the lived experience of Vermonters, the Insight Hub offers webinars, events, briefs, and peer-to-peer experiences that help philanthropists understand where their giving can make a difference in Vermont. I'm Fran Stoddard, and today's topic is Lessons from the Crisis, Next Steps for College and Career Training. In 2020, the Community Foundation and its partners granted more than $3.4 million to college and career training initiatives that moved the needle on enrollment and offered a credible framework for pandemic-era public policy. Today, we'll hear about the impacts and insights generated by that grant making and hear important perspectives on what's next for college and career training in Vermont. There will be opportunities for attendees to ask questions today. We will have a 15-minute audience Q&A towards the end of the session, but we encourage you to submit your questions at any point using the Q&A feature that you should see at the bottom of your Zoom window. The chat shows, but it has been disabled. And of course, this is being recorded and will be posted on vermontcf.org. Additionally, if you think of questions after the webinar concludes, feel free to send them to info@vermontcf.org. And we are going to start off, of course, with this wonderful webinar with Community Foundation President and CEO, Dan Smith. Go ahead, Dan.
Good morning and good afternoon, and thank you, Fran. Thank you, everybody, for participating. And I want to thank the folks who shared their stories for the video that you'll see in a little bit. I want to thank Mamie and Joyce Judy for participating in this webinar as well, and in the discussion around learners in transition, college and career training as we emerge from the pandemic. You know, we're coming off an incredible year as an organization, as a state, as a country, as a globe. It's a year of incredible challenge, but also tremendous inspiration. Vermonters stepped up for each other. We looked out for each other. We gave, we got vaccinated. We took care of our neighbors. And we did this in a time that was not just an urgent crisis, but also one in which we became increasingly aware that the crisis was falling on an economy and a society that was incredibly fragile and incredibly vulnerable. We managed in Vermont the public health crisis better than almost everywhere else. But the question remains as to whether or not we can manage our social, economic, and civic challenges as well as we navigated the public health challenge. What inspires me about philanthropy is the idea, and particularly a community foundation, the idea and the opportunity to come together around a complex challenge, dig into it, bring people together, and explore it together, and then accelerate impact. And that's what I think we're hoping to do with this discussion today and going forward from here. That's the story of our response to the pandemic, what we did together over the course of the last year. And I think it's the story of what will drive Vermont forward in the years ahead. Now, this scenario in Vermont around college and career training is frankly not a pretty one. We have incredible partners and incredible teachers and educators and professors and faculty, but the systemic challenge is one that exists and has been fragile for a number of decades. And philanthropy over the course of the last year and the course of the last decade has really stepped in some inspiring ways to help thread that gap. But let me set the context a bit. Continuing your education after high school, seeking a credential of value, is the closest thing to a silver bullet for economic security in the 21st century in the US and in Vermont. In each of the economic crises of the last 12 years, low-income jobs, entry-level, low-wage jobs were the first to go and the last to recover. That's true nationally and true in Vermont. And yet in Vermont, the context is especially unique. The transition from high school is the leakiest point in our bucket. We leave too many people behind. And we've seen those consequences, the civic and social and economic consequences as public health, and the social consequences of frustration and hopelessness abound. When you got a leaky bucket, you got to find the biggest hole first. You got to fix it. For more than 20 years, Vermont employers have highlighted workforce as a barrier to economic growth. Yet our approach in this state has retained the highest of hurdles to accessing the knowledge economy, to accessing economic security for those most likely to benefit from the accessing education. We have a high school graduation rate and a low college continuation rate. And statistically, low-income Vermonters are the least likely to continue their education and take that next step. Most people aren't aware of the degree to which our state is an outlier. We're 49th or 50th in terms of public funding for post-secondary education. That's not new. We've been an outlier for decades. But what's striking is not just the ranking, it's the degree to which we're below the national average, nearly 50 to 60%. That means the kinds of degrees that are tied to the most promising career paths are frequently 3 to 5 times more expensive as they might be in any other state. This may seem obvious, but continuing to leave people behind systemically, which it's no surprise that low-income Vermonters are less likely to continue their education when the degrees to which they may aspire are 3 to 5 times more expensive as they might be. Fewer poor people are simply going to participate. Less than 4 in 10 low-income Vermont youth enroll in a degree program after high school. And since half of those who do enroll leave the state to do so, it follows that Vermont has the highest poverty rate among 18 to 34-year-olds in New England. What's frequently lost in that discussion is why that matters to everybody in Vermont and why philanthropy has a role. First and foremost, when people are left out and left behind, again, there are civic, social, and economic consequences. And in Vermont, we saw the pandemic accelerate those conditions, particularly for low-wage and workers left out of the knowledge economy. Philanthropy has a role because it's often asked to step into the gaps of public strategy. That's been the case here for the last decade, and especially so in the last year. We were able to move quickly because we had strong partners in the post-secondary education space, and because we knew the pandemic would cause employment and enrollment disruptions, we saw the potential for philanthropy to broadly inspire and to offer hope in the face of such uncertainty. The McClure Foundation grad gift to the class of 2020, the Curtis Fund's work in Credentials of Value, the Learners in Transition initiative out of the COVID Response Fund at the Vermont Community Foundation, all rolled into a remarkable collective strategy, totaling more than $3.4 million that offered hope in an uncertain time, in an uncertain and volatile environment, particularly for new graduates, particularly for those who are disrupted in the economy. I hope you bear that in mind as grant makers and donors in attendance, that we continue to be in a disrupted environment. And there is no better platform for economic and social mobility. There's no stronger tool for achieving equity in Vermont communities than continuing your education or training after high school. Vermont simply lets too many young people off the hook at the point of that transition. And grant making right now shows up in an incredibly turbulent environment. The public systems in Vermont and higher education as a whole across this country was on an unsustainable and an incredibly challenging trajectory. In many cases, the structures of higher education were contributing to inequality and inequity across the country. And in Vermont, the financial challenges of the public institutions are well documented and well known, but philanthropy is showing up into a turbulent environment. These institutions have since been flooded with one-time money. And so the thing that I'd ask grant makers and donors to continue to bear in mind as they listen to this conversation, as we explore the insights generated from $3.5 million worth of partnerships over the course of the last year, that the long-term strategic question, the long-term objectives about the role of public post-secondary education, the role of post-secondary education, and the need to shore up common experience around the achievement of economic security and economic mobility needs to get answered. Those strategic questions are still out there. And as funders, we have an obligation, I think, to come to the table with the insight we have and pursue the strategies that will help us thread the needle to a common experience economically, civically, and socially for our wonderful state and for Vermonters across the state. So with that in mind, I think we're going to have a wonderful conversation today. We're going to hear from some great folks, and it's going to be, I think, truly illuminating, and I look forward to addressing any questions and participating in the Q&A in a little bit. I'll turn it back to Fran, but again, thank you for participating and all that you have all done for Vermonters over the last year.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's a great lead in to our next presenter, Carolyn Weir, who is the Executive Director of McClure Foundation. Carolyn has spent the last 8 years in her work at the Community Foundation and the McClure Foundation focused on the issues of workforce development and equity in college and career training. So Carolyn, let's jump right in. What was going on last spring that prompted the Community Foundation and its partners to think big and moves so quickly in connecting people in Vermont to college and career?
Well, I think we can all remember how last spring was characterized by uncertainty. As it relates to college and career training, there was uncertainty about how education could be safely delivered in the fall, about changes in students and families' ability to pay. Nationally, the early signs of mass deferments in college and career training among high school grads was becoming clear. And here in Vermont, that was compounded by some uncertainty about whether some of our colleges would exist in their current form by the time a student completed their degree. And then at the same time, of course, the pandemic was generating the largest employment disruption any of us can remember. This time last year, Vermont actually ranked second in the nation for the percentage of jobs lost due to the pandemic. So many adults were out of work or feeling unsafe or insecure in their work. Some were thinking about career changes and the education and training they'd need to make that change. So it was against that backdrop that the Community Foundation and its affiliates considered how philanthropy could help connect people in Vermont to college, to training, to careers. Between the Curtis Fund's $1.5 million in annual scholarships, some new big plays from the McClure Foundation, and a grant-making initiative within the COVID-19 Response Fund at the Community Foundation, we focused grant-making towards college and career training last year, towards students and schools and systems in ways that we hoped would drive more equity and resilience. So today we get to share a little bit about that work and what it made possible, and then talk about what comes next.
Oh, okay, so let's hear about some of that work. Can you give us an example or two of some of the new ways that the Community Foundation and its partners supported college and career training during this, unprecedented year of the pandemic?
I can profile two of the initiatives that we designed and funded and then learned from last year. First is one that Dan mentioned. This is the McClure Foundation's promise of a free course at the Community College of Vermont to everyone in the Vermont high school class of 2020. We made this promise primarily for two reasons. The first was to make it easy for students to continue their learning during the pandemic. And number two was to support a relational handoff between high school-based counselors and then the advisors at the college level who could help young adults make a plan for next steps. And given all the uncertainties in play, Fran, we quite frankly weren't sure how many students would take us up on the offer. Level enrollment of this cohort at CCV of around 300 seemed like a reasonable target, but by September, over 600 students had enrolled in their free course. So double the typical enrollment of this cohort at CCV. And this happened at a time when first-year enrollment at community colleges declined nationally by double digits. Now, 50% of the 600 or so students identify as first in family to complete college. And actually, Orleans County had the highest participation rate relative to its young adult population. And for those folks joining us today outside of Vermont, Orleans County is in Vermont's most rural region. Now, 90% of the 1,200 or so courses that students took were completed. 80% of surveyed students said that they actually connected with their CCV advisor most to make a plan for next steps. And many students told us that they just wouldn't have considered continuing their education last year without the free course, and that this very low risk opportunity to try college did a lot to clarify their interests and their abilities, which I think is part of why we saw higher than expected rates of continuation in the spring. So that's a snapshot of the first initiative we wanted to share today, essentially a mini universal college access play that generated a lot of student engagement. The second initiative was a more focused investment in specific critical occupational pathways. So some of you know that the McClure Foundation has long produced a list of Vermont's most promising jobs in partnership with the Vermont Department of Labor. When we went to update that list last fall with newly available data, it was really clear that many of the jobs on that list could be obtained with short-term career training programs. But at the same time, we knew that it can be overwhelming, and I think understandably so, for people to navigate the hundreds of training programs available in the state. So with lots of input and analysis, we selected 7 short-term career training programs in Vermont that we consider best bets for landing a promising job in 2021, really as a one way to help job seekers find the program that's right for them. These 7 programs stood out to us because they're affordable, they're short, They're easily accessible across the state. They reliably lead to promising jobs on career pathways with even higher pay down the road with more training in sectors like healthcare and finance and IT and marketing. And they're all offered by CCV and Vermont Tech. So two institutions that have a really strong track record supporting Vermonters of all backgrounds. There are programs like the bookkeeping certificate at CCV, where all of the courses and the costs actually count toward an associate degree in accounting if a completer ever wants to go back to school, and the licensed practical nursing program at Vermont Tech. So $350,000 in grants from the COVID-19 Response Fund at the Community Foundation is helping make these programs more affordable and more accessible this year, mostly through programmatic investments and enrollment incentives administered by the colleges, but also in partnership with the Curtis Fund and its leading edge scholarships for non-degree programs that lead to credentials of value and livable wage jobs, which has awarded scholarships to well over 100 students this past year, including for the programs we consider best bets. So that's it, Fran. Brief profile of the two initiatives that were pandemic era approaches for supporting students.
Really impressive. And I know that's not all. The story is much bigger than that, but very impressive. And so you mentioned an implicit goal was to learn from some of the initiatives that you designed and funded. So what did you end up learning?
So reflecting on the past year and all of the ways that as foundations, we were privileged to offer some hope to people in Vermont in this time, I see probably 4 lessons or takeaways that contributed to the success of these initiatives. First was the design values of hope and simplicity. Every single part of these initiatives was designed to be easy to understand and to access. So for example, the scholarships were first dollar in. We always lean toward inclusivity when determining eligibility, and that meant that our messaging could be really positive without any fine print. Number 2, the choice of institutional partners for these initiatives was key. So for example, our class of 2020 promise, we partnered with CCV, which is an institution that is built to quickly scale. And to give folks a sense of just how ready and adaptive CCV was, we went from idea to public launch with the governor in 9 days. Also, becoming a community college student is simple, so is transferring credits. So that's part of what makes community colleges a logical partner in continuation initiatives across the country. Number 3, it was important for us to fund institutional capacity to promote and administer and evaluate these initiatives and to help provide wraparound supports to students. That evaluation capacity in particular was critical. I mean, it gave us insight into what was working, but it also reaffirmed some systemic barriers to success. Students of color and men in that cohort of 600 had moderately lower rates of course completion and success than did white students and women, which is yet another reminder of some of the systemic barriers to student success that we're all continuing to understand in our attempt to help dismantle them. And then finally, in making a big promise or a big play like this that a lot of folks heard about, we actually changed a segment of the public's perception of the affordability and ease of access of college last fall. And given the response, I think we're more confident than ever that a wide scale change in perception like that drives enrollment, especially in a high tuition state.
Fantastic. And you, of course, have been sharing some of these successes and what you learned with other public and private funders. What are some of the impacts of this work so far?
Well, I think as it happens, the conditions have been right for public and private funders to continue or expand some of the approaches that philanthropy engineered and tested and learned from last year. So that's played out in a couple of ways. Starting last fall, inspired by the early success of the class of 2020 promise, the state legislature funded a free course at any of the Vermont state colleges for people whose employment was impacted by the pandemic. Enrollment for those courses filled up in a long weekend. And since then, the state has made 2 more investments in free courses. Last month, inspired by the class of 2020 promise again, foundations in New Hampshire announced a free course for the New Hampshire class of 2021 at community colleges there. And then here in Vermont, the Green Mountain graduation gift was announced. And we think it's a big deal. It's one free course at any of the Vermont state colleges to all class of 2020 and class of 2021 grads, funded by a one-time appropriation to VSAC. And then finally, included in the budget bill that Governor Scott signed this month is a $5 million one-time appropriation for a year of free tuition for critical occupations programs at the state colleges. And the starting point for that list of programs was the programs that we consider best bets. So that's a lot of one-time pandemic era affordability and supports and enrollment incentives. And it's not even the full list. So I do think it's worth taking a moment to celebrate those investments. This next year, public college and career training will be more affordable for Vermonters than any time in recent memory. And there's important work ahead to connect people to those programs, to support continuation and completion for people who do enroll. And we can all play a part in that, including by spreading word to anyone who's thinking about college and career training. It's something I did earlier this month with my kids' preschool teachers, because their young adult children are still figuring out how work and school will fit into their lives. So the recent one-time public investments that I mentioned seem primarily designed to credential workers in the short term, not necessarily to sustain the programs that credential those workers for the long term. And there's a lot of work ahead on that front too. From my perspective, doing the latter in ways that also sustain the public's new and different perception of the value of college and career training will require approaches to affordability beyond scholarships and beyond enrollment incentives, as powerful as those approaches have been during the pandemic, and as important a puzzle piece as they will likely continue to play in the overall affordability picture. Our vision of what's possible in Vermont has really been clarified by what we learned last year. It's easily understood and easily accessed, guaranteed affordable college and career training options that lead to good jobs and that create more equity and resilience in communities by centering the people in Vermont who have the most to gain from a credential and finding ways to spotlight those credentials that are most needed. So, Fran, I'll leave you with this image. It's a recent analysis from College Board shared by a national media outlet of pandemic era community college enrollment among recent high school grads. And it represents part of the story we're telling today and why we're telling it. The extent to which Vermont was an outlier last year should make us feel good, especially in the context that Dan shared of how Vermont is usually an outlier for its continuation and public financing weaknesses. So this map makes me really hopeful about how we as a state can carry what we learned from last year forward in ways that help sustain those high enrollment rates and ensure equitable value in Vermont's higher ed systems. And I'm really glad we have the benefit of guest speakers today to continue that conversation with us.
Terrific, Carolyn. It's a very hopeful report. Thank you for your impressive summary and what you guys have done. And we will be getting to our guest speakers in just a minute. But of course, at the core of all this work are the students. So we want to share a little bit of what they have to say. And here are a few folks that have benefited from philanthropy of the Community Foundation and its partners.
Hi, my name is Leah. I just graduated from the landscape contracting program at Vermont Technical College. I was able to receive an associate's degree in applied sciences. I really wanted to learn about plants, and I wanted a short program that didn't cost too much. Money was a huge factor for me. I don't make a lot of money. I never have. I'd like to hopefully make a little bit more money now that I've received this degree. I couldn't have done it without receiving scholarships and grants. It was really helpful. And I just want to thank the Curtis Foundation for giving me that money and giving me the chance to finish school.
Hi, my name is Sophie Decker, and I am a recent CCV 2021 graduate. I was able to use the McClure grant to get one of my early childhood education classes for free. It ended up being early childhood development, which is something very near and dear to my heart, and it helped me continue my training, so I was able to get this. For the future, I am going on to UVM to get my bachelor's degree in early childhood education, and hopefully after that onto my master's degree in the same subject matter.
My name is Ian Barker. I'm a senior at Vermont Tech in the Manufacturing Engineering program. Someday I would like to create assistive devices for people like me with cerebral palsy and other disabilities. The Curtis Fund has allowed me to offer to work for free this summer, since I won't have to worry about making money to pay for college. And I hope that that will open more doors to gain experience and make more connections in my field before I graduate.
Hi, my name is Vicky. I'm 50 years old and I live in Randolph, Vermont with my husband and 13-year-old son. In March of 2020, I returned to college at CCV Montpelier to continue my associate's degree that I had started over 30 years ago. I graduated just in this spring of 2021, and I'm a first-generation college graduate. I'm now enrolled at Northern Vermont University in their Interdisciplinary Studies degree program. Being a recipient of the Curtis Fund Scholarship inspires me to keep going even when I'm feeling really discouraged and the challenges seem all-consuming. I think of the huge heart of Emma Eliza Curtis and the generosity of the many that have built the scholarship funds up so high. And I tell myself that the best gift I can give back is my hard work and dedication to reach my educational goals. Thank you, Mrs. Curtis, for leaving such a beautiful legacy for others to build upon and benefit from.
Hey guys, I'm Mac. I'm from Northfield, Vermont, and I've been a Curtis Fund scholarship recipient for 2 years now. I learned so much at my school. It's super hands-on. I get to work with the animals and do like really incredible science things and meet such awesome people and make really great connections, and I'm so thankful for everything I've been able to do, and I definitely wouldn't be able to do that with scholarships, so I hope we're able to keep this going and help out a whole bunch of other people.
Wonderful. We'd like to thank all of the dedicated students who shared their story with us. I want to turn the conversation now to Joyce Judy and Mamie Voigt, two leaders in the post-secondary education space, one right here in Vermont and the other working at the national level in Washington, D.C. Then we'll go to a Q&A for your questions. We've already received one for Carolyn, but we're going to wait for the Q&A section to go there. So thank you for that question. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window at any time. But right now, we will begin with Joyce. She, of course, is the president of Community College of Vermont. A special focus of her work is on expanding access to higher education for all Vermonters, from high school students to adult students seeking new career opportunities. In 2020, Joyce and CCV were instrumental in the success of the McClure Foundation's graduation gift. Go ahead, Joyce.
Thank you so much, Fran, and thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about CCV. And I just have to say, the video that we just watched, this is all our work. This is all about students and student success. And you know, I have been at the college for a number of years, and our mission for 50 years has been about affordability, access, and success. And we, through the last 15 months of COVID, we've really learned a lot about all three of those pieces. And we've been able to try some things that we have wanted to try for a number of years. So I want to first talk about access. And that's the first part of our mission. And as many of you know, CCV has 12 physical locations around the state. And that was our first way of bringing education to Vermonters. This was the vision of Governor Dean Davis in 1970 when we were created. How do you take education to Vermonters locally? I don't think he would have ever imagined that 50 years later, we'd serve 10,000 students a year and be the second largest college in the state, second only to the University of Vermont. But even having those 12 physical locations was not enough to increase access. And so over the years, we started an online program in 1996, long before it was part of a trend and fashionable. But we started an online education, because it was a tool in our toolbox about access. And so if you were a veteran and you were deployed overseas, or you were a single mom and you didn't have childcare, but you wanted to continue your education, now all of a sudden, with online as an option, you can access a college course from anywhere. So for many years, we were offering both on-ground and online courses. That was great. We were growing and we were seeing students respond. But during COVID, we actually had to pivot to completely remote learning. And we quickly ramped up 5 different ways that students could access remotely. And one that is become really popular, and we will continue it takes geography out of it. So it's a combination of synchronous learning. So students can actually meet with a faculty member, meet with their classmates in a given, like maybe every 3rd Tuesday. And then in between times, there's a very heavy online component. And so through COVID, we introduced this combination of in-person, but virtual in-person and online. And I have to say, I think that is a format that is going to continue in a really positive vein. And again, it's about how do we increase access to all Vermonters, no matter where they are located, or no matter what their schedule is, if we can remove geography. And again, I think for people that know me, you know that I am definitely a face-to-face person, but I also know that we have to help people learn to use the tools that are available to them. And sometimes their life circumstances prevent them from being in a specific place at a specific time. So access has been an important part of our mission. And through COVID, we actually were able to leapfrog ahead. And it was the support of some philanthropists that really helped us launch our synchronous online program, because it came with a lot of need for faculty development, a lot of professional development for our staff. And so that was a huge support to us. A second piece that, and you've heard a lot about this today, but I just want to share my story around affordability. Vermont, even though the Community College of Vermont is by far the least expensive college program in Vermont, we are one of the most expensive community colleges in the country. Sometimes we're the most expensive, sometimes we're the 2nd or 3rd most expensive, but we are in that tier of expensive. But it's not because of our model. Our delivery model is actually below the national average. But historically, it has been a situation where Vermont has heavily funded K-12 and less so for post-secondary. And so it has made college expensive. And, I've had people ask me, because you heard Dan refer to, Vermont has a very high school graduation rate, but a low college going rate. And people have often asked me, is it just about money? And I will say it's not just about money, but you cannot, when we're expensive, you have to take that into consideration. And so during this past year with the McClure Foundation grad gift, we were actually able to remove costs as a barrier. And all of a sudden we saw a huge uptick in the number of students wanting to invest in themselves and pursue a college degree. I had a legislator ask me but funding only one course, what difference does that make? And I want to share this story because it makes a huge difference to the population that we are most interested in reaching and investing. So we had a student, and I can tell another story about how we connected with this student, but we had a student who testified in the legislature, and she was not handpicked. We happened to just reach out to a group of students and she came forward. She took advantage of the McClure gift, but her story is an interesting one. She was a foster child. She turned 18 during her senior year. She did not have a good experience with her last foster family. And so at 18, she was out on her own. She was couch surfing. She was working. She was trying to finish her high school. And she ended up getting her GED, and she was working. So she finished her GED, she was working. And then in May of last year, she was laid off. And her employer felt horrible and told this student, or told this person, that she should go to CCV because she knew that there was a free course available to her. So the student who never thought she could go to college, never thought she was worth investing in, all of a sudden reached out to CCV, and within 2 days she was enrolled in a course. And now she is continuing because she got hooked up with an advisor, she got hooked up with a financial aid counselor, and the rest is history. It's one student at a time that we can make a difference with. And I hold on to that story because there are thousands of those stories around the state of Vermont. So affordability is huge in Vermont, and anything we can do to reduce the cost is important. The third part of our mission is about success. And so we often find that it's not just helping to pay for tuition, and it's not just helping to get students enrolled, but it's really wrapping around students and making sure they're successful. And we found a few years ago that we were seeing students drop out because they had sudden expenses. All of a sudden, their car needed a new tire, or they needed a new transmission, or they had a sudden medical bill and they had no safety net. And we found that these gifts of less than $200 could be the difference between a student staying enrolled and dropping out. So we have created what we call the Life Gap program, and it is available to students on an emergency basis. And we have just found that those small amounts of money can change the trajectory of a student. It keeps them focused on their education and not being derailed by life. And so, as I think about the things that, our partnership with philanthropy and philanthropists has been incredible, because anytime we create programs, it's totally on the backs of students. So anytime we can get funding from outside people that believe in the power of education, it's just so helpful in helping us reach so many more Vermonters, particularly first generation low income students who never ever thought that college was possible. And all of a sudden they're enrolled, their whole life has changed, they've invested in themselves, and the future is just incredibly open and available, and they have such a positive outlook. So I'm going to stop there, turn that back to Fran, but I'm happy to take questions later.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joyce. Really, really wonderful stories. And now we will hear from Mamie Voigt, Interim President of the Institute for Higher Education Policy and Managing Partner of the Post-Secondary Value Commission. In these roles, Mamie works with national partners to answer the question, what is college worth? By working towards an answer, we can have a better understanding of how public and private investment can create more equity in post-secondary education. Welcome, Mamie.
Thank you, Fran, and it's wonderful to be here with you. It's been inspirational to hear the stories of the students in the videos that spoke earlier, and of Carolyn and Dan and Judy, and about all the great work that you all are doing in Vermont. You all really seem to recognize the importance of educational opportunity for all, regardless of race or income or background or circumstance. And you've been really intentional, especially over this past year during COVID, in the schools that you support, with this focus on community colleges, where so many students from low-income backgrounds or first-generation college goers are attending college. And it was really impressive to see that map that we saw earlier, with the 34% increase in enrollment at two-year colleges in Vermont, because that would be exceptional in a normal year. But given the declines that we've seen in enrollments nationwide across community colleges during the pandemic, it really is truly exceptional to see that trend here in Vermont. And the work that you're doing here is really closely aligned with the work of the Post-Secondary Value Commission, which is an initiative that the Institute for Higher Education Policy, where I work, led in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and AskU. And this work began 2 years ago, before the pandemic. We never could have imagined the world into which we would be now releasing this work. But it was driven by the expertise of 30 commissioners, experts across the fields of higher education and the workforce, who were really embracing the vision that and the recognition that higher education should be a pathway to a better living and a better life for all students, regardless of race, ethnicity, economic background, or gender. But right now, the data are very clear that the value that's delivered to students who are attending education after high school, it varies greatly by who a student is and where they come from, and it absolutely shouldn't. So this was a motivating factor for the commission in their work. There were really troubling trends that we saw in the data that revealed inequities in access to institutions and to programs, completion rates that are still too low across the board, differences in educational quality and the supports that are provided to students, and really clear disparities in post-college outcomes and the debt loads that students are taking on in order to attend college. So combined, all of these trends are putting social and economic mobility out of reach for too many students, especially for Black, Latinx, Indigenous, underserved Asian American Pacific Islander students and students from low-income backgrounds. And so the commission took a three-pronged approach to this work: to first define post-secondary value, second, to measure post-secondary value, and then third, to come up with recommendations for actions that would move towards a more equitable post-secondary system that would benefit students, families, communities, and society as a whole. So first off, we as the commission defined post-secondary value, and I'll just give you that definition that the commission came up with. Students experience post-secondary value when provided equitable access and support to complete quality, affordable credentials that offer economic mobility and prepare them to advance racial and economic justice in our society. Using that definition as really a North Star for the work, we then developed a way to bring data to bear on the conversations and to measure post-secondary value. And we did that through a series of thresholds that assess how much better off students are after attending a particular institution or a particular program. And we used a series of 6 thresholds that measure everything from whether students receive at least a minimum economic return to whether they're achieving economic mobility or reaching levels of economic security in their life. By conducting analyses using these different thresholds, we found a number of different findings. We have quite a bit of work presented on our website, but I'll give you just kind of a glimpse of a few of the key findings from this work. One is that outcomes vary across programs and across institutions. And I think that's really closely aligned with the Vermont Best Bet programs that you've identified, where you've seen some programs are generating higher levels of economic returns for students. And that's important information for students and for policymakers to know to help inform decisions. A second big finding of this work is that completion matters. It's not just a question of access to college, but a question of completion of that credential as well. And this goes along with what Joyce was saying about the work that you all are doing in the community colleges in Vermont. One statistic that was really telling as part of this work was that for Black students in the University of Texas system, where we had a data partnership to dig into their data a bit more, Black students who completed their credential within the UT system earned 59% more than Black students who attended but didn't complete. And similarly for Latinx students, those who completed their credentials earned 81% more than students who didn't complete their credentials. And those gains were much larger and more substantial for students of color than they were for white students. So this is really a question of equity as well. And then finally, these individual returns mean something for society as well. The Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce conducted some research as part of the Value Commission's work, and they examined what would happen if we were to close the racial and socioeconomic gaps in higher education attainment across the country. And if we were to do that, we would generate an additional $956 billion in annual public benefits. And so, as you all are working with your legislature and talking about the low investment from the state in public institutions within Vermont, you can use these types of figures to make a strong case for why there's an economic imperative for investing in higher education. So we define post-secondary value, we developed a framework to measure it, and then we developed an action agenda, because all of this work was never intended to sit on a shelf and collect dust and just be research. We really wanted to spur action to make change. We know that wealth and earnings disparities that we see in the data, they're deeply entrenched within American society, but they're not insurmountable if we have policymakers and employers and institutions and philanthropy diving in to take action to change these trends. And so for you all, just by having this conversation today, you're already part of the equitable value movement in higher education. And every investment that you make can be done with this lens towards equitable post-secondary value. And so I'd offer 3 suggestions that you think about your work in Vermont. One is to support students, particularly students from low-income backgrounds and students of color. Again, it was inspirational to hear the stories of the students and see how transformative investment in students really can be. It's particularly important in a high tuition state like Vermont, where affordability is such a barrier, to be investing in non-need-based financial aid. And that's for tuition, but also for the non-tuition costs that can so often derail a student's college career. Things like room and board, books, and broadband internet access, which we've seen over the course of the pandemic, is incredibly important for student success today. Second is to support institutions, especially those serving large numbers of students from low-income backgrounds or students of color, institutions like the community colleges that we're discussing today. And then finally, support better data. We could not understand the inequities that exist within the system. We could not understand the value that institutions and programs are providing to students if we didn't have high quality data. Those data, like the data that you're presenting to students for the Best Bet programs, can help to inform students' decisions about where to invest their hard-earned dollars, and can inform policymakers and philanthropy itself in thinking about investment strategies. So you can find all of the work from the commission on our website, which is postsecondaryvalue.org. But I will give you a warning, we covered a lot of ground there, so there's quite a bit of material. My communications team tells me that our page count is approaching that of War and Peace. So I would suggest that you start with the executive summary if you'd like to dive in and then figure out where to go from there. I'm also happy to connect offline with anyone and looking forward to diving into the question and answer session during the rest of the conversation today. So thank you so much for having me here and for all of the fantastic work that you're doing in Vermont.
Thank you so much, Mamie. And again, Joyce, for these insightful presentations. And yes, War and Peace. Sounds good reading. So now we'll bring in Dan and Carolyn back to the screen for your questions. And very early on, we had a question for Carolyn, so I'll go ahead and ask that. Carolyn, how do these new investments in post-secondary college and career training initiatives connect to secondary career technical centers and statewide education initiatives? Is there an opportunity to support flexible pathways, proficiency-based learning, and other agency of education efforts by supporting secondary schools or districts?
That's a great question. They do. And yes, there's one example I'm really excited to share. I think one of the long-standing barriers to broader take-up of alternative but really valuable senior year experiences made possible by flexible pathways and other things like early college, career and technical education, pre-apprenticeships, is the opportunity cost of missing out on a traditional high school experience. And the pandemic changed that barrier, right, in ways that allowed us to build on existing pathways. So the Community Foundation, through one of its pandemic recovery initiatives, worked with CCV to highlight early college, where students in Vermont enroll in college in their senior year of high school for free and connect it more directly with career pathways. So now students in the Vermont high school class of 2022 can enroll in early college at CCV aligned with one of 3 one-year certificate programs in IT service, cybersecurity, graphic design, and graduate high school with a work-ready certificate and a year's worth of free college credit. So we're trying to get the word out now.
Awesome, thank you. And one for Joyce, any thoughts on how the state, particularly the Agency of Education, could expand such access as you've discussed today?
Yeah, and building on Carolyn's comments, a couple of things that the state has done, which is, in a very positive way, has funded a dual enrollment program and an early college program, really designed to help people think that college is in their future. So for high school juniors and seniors, they are entitled to take up to 2 courses at a college that's participating in dual enrollment. We usually have about 1,000 high school juniors and seniors who participate and take a course during a course or 2 during their junior or senior year. But the program that Carolyn just mentioned is a huge program and a wonderful program, and it's relatively new in Vermont. It's the early college program where a high school senior, can actually go to CCV full time and earn a full year of college. And then one of the things that I think a lot of people on this call probably know, but maybe they don't, is that CCV credits are fully transferable. So we have direct pathways to the University of Vermont, to other Vermont state colleges, to Champlain, to Norwich. So students earn the credits that they earn at CCV can propel them forward and get a degree, a 4-year degree at another school. So the early college program and dual enrollment, we work really closely with the Agency of Education in promoting that program. And at CCV, for us, the students that we are really trying to focus on are the students in that middle swath who never thought that college was a potential for them. And they simply have taken themselves out of the college game because they think it's just simply too expensive. And even CCV, we have to think about, CCV is up to almost $1,000 a course. Well, if you are from a low to low and middle income family, $1,000 a course is expensive. And so for us, one of the things that we see is students aren't choosing between CCV and Norwich. They're choosing between CCV and not going to school. And so how do we make sure that they're enrolling in college?
Great. And thank you for that. And kind of following up in a way, this for Carolyn, but there might be others to have something to comment on this. The question is, have the barriers to completion for men and minorities in the community college programs been identified? And are there ways to help address those barriers? So Carolyn, do you want to start? And then we'll see if anyone else has a comment.
Yeah, Fran, I would actually kick that one over to Joyce, because her team is leading a number of focused programs that are seeing some real successes. But to build very quickly on what Joyce just said, I think the theme for me in this hour of conversation has really been the public's perception of affordability as our biggest barrier moving forward. And when I think about that, and I think about cost, and I think about the relative cost of CCV, I think about solutions ahead that really lower the cost of tuition for everyone as a way to sustain the public perception of not only affordability, but ease of access.
And I do want to address the question that you just asked, but I also want to make sure that we are including a wide range, recognizing that we're including a wide age range in this conversation. So I think a lot of our conversation has been focused, because of early college dual enrollment, on 18 to 20-year-olds. Our CCV's average age is 28. And so as we think about serving new Americans, we think about serving young men, that is a really important distinction for us, because we are really paying a lot of attention and trying to create more learn while you earn possibilities. And so I'll give you some examples. In our Winooski Center, which is our Chittenden County location, we have about 1,800 students that go there. 20% of those students are new Americans. And it's multi-generational, and they are not able to give up working to go to school full time. And so how do we create internships? How do we create, we're working really closely with the Department of Labor in increasing apprenticeship possibilities. So that, like, for example, we were approached by CVS a couple years ago because they have such a shortage of pharmacy tech people that are interested in going into pharmacy tech. And so we've created an apprenticeship program with them where they take courses. They also are working in a pharmacy. The learn while you earn option, I think, is key to connecting with a broader group of students, particularly young men and particularly new Americans. And it's not at the exclusion of women, but we're also seeing we are having to create programs and really focus our energy as we're reaching out to young men in ways that are different than we might do as a standard marketing campaign. I'll give you an example. In Lamoille County, we had a philanthropist step forward to fund a program called Man Up. Now, I have to tell you, we are around 70% women, serving 70% women students. And when we titled the program Man Up, I took a lot of grief for that. But you know what? We did a focus group with a few men, and they told us that this is what they wanted. And we created marketing information that really spoke to their interests. And all of a sudden, we were starting to see more and more young men. So I think we have to think about some non-traditional ways of reaching a broader spectrum of populations than we do with perhaps traditional ways.
Absolutely. We are just about out of time, and we want Dan to finish up and do a few announcements, but just quickly for each of you, in your opinion, what's the single most important piece of advice or insight for donors and grant makers thinking about supporting students in their pursuit of post-secondary education and promising jobs? So just a very quick 10 to 30 second response. Maybe do you want to take us from the high up national level first?
Happy to. I think that a key part, and this really builds on what Joyce was just saying, is keeping in mind who today's students are. And they're not the 18 to 24-year-old students who are driving off in the station wagon to campus. They are working adults, they're parenting, they are juggling many responsibilities at the same time, often from low-income backgrounds or new Americans. And so maintaining equity at the core of your decision-making and your grant-making is going to be incredibly important as you work to meet the needs of today's students, especially as we work to recover coming out of the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Mamie. And Carolyn, what would be your piece of advice?
At the level of an individual donor, I think it's starting with the question, who will benefit, and then centering your giving at the programs and institutions that serve those people at scale. In my personal giving, that means I give to an institution that is not my alma mater.
Okay, terrific. And Joyce?
I would just say affordability, and it's not just tuition dollars. It's the hidden costs, the invisible costs of education that often can derail a student.
Okay, Dan, I'm going to give you the last word in many ways, and so hold your thought about this piece of advice. As I just close out myself with a few housekeeping notes, take a moment to fill out the survey that will appear as soon as you log off this webinar. It will help us plan for future events. Also, watch your inbox for an email that includes a one-page summary of key takeaways from today's events. And lastly, as we've noted all along, this is the second actually in a series of Insight Hub events. So we hope you will join us again in the future. The Insight Hub has many more events planned, so keep an eye out for those invitations and visit vermontcf.org/insighthub to sign up for those emails and make sure you don't miss them. So now back to you, Dan. You can give us our piece of advice and close this session. Thank you all so much.
Fran, thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists and folks who participated. One of the things that I find most inspiring about the Community Foundation is the visibility we have into complex problems and things going on in Vermont communities, and the ways in which we can help align philanthropy to make a difference on our biggest challenges. 75 years ago, Springfield, Vermont was a hotbed of innovation and engineering and had the highest median incomes in the state. Today, that is not the case. 50 years ago, there were more than 2,000 dairy farms in Vermont. We're down to about 600. When we talk about what the next generation of Vermonters needs to learn how to do and what they need to study and particularly among those who are borrowing money to go to school, for those whom the costs of attendance are out of reach. Like what they study, learning how to do something that they get paid to do in Vermont communities is fundamental to our long-term civic, social, and economic vitality. Bear that in mind as you think about the role your philanthropy plays in Vermont communities and a role it plays in setting the agenda and setting the future for young people in Vermont. And know that these things aren't static over time. Communities change, economies change, needs change, but the very real dynamics that exist in Vermont, the vast disparity in lived experience that we're seeing and is compounded by the migratory patterns of the pandemic, are challenges we're going to have to wrestle with for some time, and that there's a role for post-secondary education, in particular public access institutions, to play as we chart the path forward. Thank you very much. I really appreciate everybody being here and taking the time to participate. Thank you, Mamie, for coming in from DC or participating from DC, and thanks again to Fran and Joyce for participating.